most, the full moon rises and sets every month without any scrutiny. But for the men in this tale, its menace will not be forgotten. Tales to the Void presents Full Moon Throwdown.
Hey, Rafik. You still got time for me today? Of course! Rafik's voice boomed loudly from the other end. Just come by around 8. I have office hours until then, but after that I'll be available. I gave my students a taste of what their exams will be like, and some of them have realized their understanding of magic-based interactions to the physical world are not as good as they thought, he said with a little mischief in his voice. Yeah, kids are stupid like that. I'll see you then. Drive safe, he said before I hung up. A few weeks had passed since the Robble incident, as I was calling it now, and it had been cropping up in my brain practically non-stop. Right after I banished the ghost, Robble jumped down my throat. She laid into me about her house getting trashed and how my incompetence was to blame. No matter how much I explained to her that a spectral infestation like that had never happened before, she still chewed me up like a bad steak. The police showed up to her house as she was practically throttling me. They had to hold her back until her husband got there. Somehow he calmed her down. A pair of cops took a statement from me, but I could tell that they didn't trust my word. They kept trying to pin the whole thing on me as some kind of scam, or that Robble and I were in on it together. We kept going back and forth when a news van showed up. That's when the party really got started. As soon as that camera turned on, the newswoman started demanding answers from everyone in the area. I tried to sneak away while she spoke to the cops, but the officers singled me out as the ward that banished the ghost. Those fuckers. I tried to make a break for it in my car, but I was blocked in on both sides. I hunkered down and only gave her 1 or 2-word answers as she assailed me with questions. I did my best to deflect the blame from me, and gave her a line about some kind of freak accident that caused the ring to burst out, which in turn let the ghost escape. For a second, she almost bought it. She demanded to know if it was true that the ghost had telekinetic powers, and whether people would have to start worrying about ghostly attackers. I told her I just worked the job and made my escape. I had to jump the curb a bit, but I was able to get around the car in front of me. I heard her try to yell a few more questions at me as I left, but I kept my lips shut. Along the way home, I popped into an urgent care and got a look over. The doctor told me whatever truck I tried to fight worked me over pretty good. I had a few cracked ribs, massive bruising along my back, and possibly concussion on top of all my other aches and pains. He told me to take it easy for a while and that I'd be 100% in a few weeks. The next several days were filled with phone calls, a few whack jobs that swore they had some crazy powerful spirit messing with their lives, and a lot of Tylenol. I checked out the first few clients that came my way, but quickly realized they were all full of shit and were just trying to grab their 5 minutes of fame from me. When I wasn't busy snipe hunting, I put in a few calls to some other wards in the area. I didn't bullshit these guys like I did the news people though. If they knew something, I didn't want them thinking I was pulling their leg. A few were interested and wanted to hear about every little detail I could remember, but most told me it was a freak accident and just to ignore it. Even with everyone telling me the stuff from that night shouldn't have happened, and definitely wouldn't happen twice, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The nagging in my brain finally got bad enough that I called in a specialist, Dr. Rafik Amari. He's a professor of occult studies out of the University of Michigan. The first time we met was when I got called in to clear out a ghost ball at the Union. He was there testing a few theories he had about the relationship between magic and ghosts. His plan was to turn them all from wanderers into protectors. I tried to tell him it wasn't possible, but he was sure he could do it. Funnily enough, he couldn't, and just made everything worse. After our eventful night together, I convinced, he would say intimidated, him into buying me a drink. We ended up hitting it off and have been pretty good friends since. Sometimes he would call and chat with me about work and whatever new research he had going on. I did my best to respond like I knew what he was talking about. When I called about the Robble incident, he was more than happy to pick and prod at it. He asked me to stop by after a few days so that we could go over everything in detail. I had some time to kill before our meeting, so I messed around the shop a bit, took care of some business, and hit the road after dinner. I got off the freeway at State Street and rolled my window down to enjoy the cool air. It was late September now, which meant the students were out in full force. Hundreds of 20-somethings walked the sidewalks with backpacks full of books, computers, or beer if they're lucky. Most of the houses I drove past were covered with cheap decorations or the debris from previous parties. On the front of one of the houses hung a large wooden sign with big yellow words spray painted on. 21 to drink, 18 to party. That one got a quick chuckle out of me. Rafiq's office was located on the university's central campus, inside a building that could have been transported right out of DC. It had a number of large stone columns with some flowery bullshit carved above the stairs leading in. I thought it was a little much, but Angel Hall did have its charm. I spotted an open parking spot in the street and quickly drove in. Parking was a bitch in Ann Arbor, and I didn't feel like navigating on the one-way streets and self-involved students to find another one. "Lock up for me, would you, Issa?" I said as I left the car. She beeped twice in response as I heard the locks fall into place. I overheard a pair of students talking loudly to one another as I walked in. "If we don't get into ADP tonight, I am going to be pissed," a pale, red-headed girl said to her friend. "I'm ready to party down, and nothing is going to stop me." "Calm down, Fang. We'll get in, no problem," the other girl responded nonchalantly. I was a little surprised to hear the vampire slur drop so innocently in public like that, but the redhead didn't seem to mind. "Oh, we better, because I'm drinking like a whole bag of Opossy before we leave the dorm, and we both know what happens after that." I was glad when the door shut me off from the two girls and their conversation. I didn't feel like listening to any more of their plans for the evening, especially if they involved the Red Rush. A couple of vampires explained to me one time what it was like drinking blood. They described it like getting drunk on the best liquor you could imagine, then chasing with a bolt of lightning directly into your heart. Drinking blood was as illegal as any other drug, but in a college town like this, there was always a supply coming in from somewhere. I made it to Rafiq's department on the third floor without hearing any more party plans. His department wasn't as big as a lot of others, so he split the hall with the history department. A few office doors were open, and I saw graduate students cramped inside the small spaces 2 or 3 at a time. Each room seemed to be covered in books and posters, with desks practically buried in papers. Their rooms looked so miserable, they made my office feel like the Taj Mahal. Thankfully, Rafiq was the head of his department, and didn't have to worry about sharing his office with anyone else, though the size still left a lot to be desired. His door was open and I could hear him droning on. I thought about hanging around outside for him to finish, but I didn't really want to be stuck waiting through a whole lecture. A few knocks on the door pulled his attention away from the young man he was speaking to. Rafiq was exactly what you'd expect from a college professor, bookish with a soft physique and a comically bad sense of style, all mixed together with a friendly and patient demeanor. A trait he picked up from years of dealing with annoying students trying to prove their high school education was better than over 20 years of study. It was easy to write him off as forgettable, until you caught his eyes. They were bright yellow, with pupils that would contract into vertical slits in the light. As a homo licanus, he sported the features of his animal ancestry, which in his case was a lion or panther or something. "Hey, Rafiq," I said, ignoring the student inside. "I'm ready whenever you are." "Bailey, it's great to see you." He turned back to his student. "I'm sorry, Daniel, but I'm going to have to cut our conversation short today. Feel free to email me if you have any more questions." "That's okay, Professor. I think I got it at the end there. I'll see you in class." Daniel slung his backpack over his shoulder and stalked out of the room. The glare he gave me as he left told me he still needed to speak to Rafiq. I gave him a wink and closed the door behind him. Rafiq stood up and pulled me into a hug. I returned the gesture awkwardly. He knew I wasn't a real big fan of hugging, but he liked to say that friendship is the start of family and you always hug family, or something equally sappy. He released me and we both took a seat. "Your eyes are looking as yellow as ever. You have something fishy for dinner?" While I often joked about his heritage, it was true that today his eyes were especially pronounced. "Ah, yes," he said, pointing upwards. "Full moon tonight. But that is nothing new. Please, tell me how you've been. Besides the obvious, I mean. Alright, I guess. Business has kind of picked up since the whole thing has started, though I've had to wade through a sea of nut jobs first. How so? Just a bunch of morons who want to blame all their troubles on ghosts. What if they actually have a problem, though? Classic Rafiq, willing to take people at their word without a second thought. The day ghosts start filling computers with porn is the day I follow my passion and become a midwife. How have you been? Very good, actually. Especially when you came to me with your recent troubles. He spun in his chair and started to dig around his desk. I don't know how I feel about you getting enjoyment out of my life's struggles. Don't worry, Bailey. You'll appreciate this. He pulled a clear, labeled bag from within his desk. Inside, I glimpsed a leather-bound journal, cracked and discolored with age. I wasn't sure when he'd done it, but a pair of latex gloves covered his hands as he pulled the book from the bag. A friend of mine happened upon this book recently. He's a history professor here with a focus on colonial America. He spends his summers at dig sites to try and uncover artifacts to examine. Last month, he found this journal. Rafiq skimmed through the journal gently, turning the pages like they disintegrated at a moment's notice. I got out of my chair and leaned over him to get a better look. He turned around and put his hand up to me like he was asking me to stop at an intersection. Would you mind stepping back, please? This journal is in very delicate condition, and I'm afraid that any kind of oil or spit might cause irreparable damage. I moved back a step from Rafiq in the book. Do I spit when I talk? I asked, a little curious about what he was implying. He turned from the book and looked at me with a slight grin. I've seen you do it a few times, when you're excited. I just prefer to be safe. With his back turned, I made a few motions with my mouth, trying to figure out what he was talking about. As I worked my jaw, I heard him exclaim excitedly, "Aha! You found what you were looking for?" Yes, right here. I remembered reading this passage a few days before you called me and realized it pertains to what you had dealt with almost to a T. Alright then, spit it out, I said, anxious to know who I could blame for my recent brush with the insane. Before I do, I have to give you some background on this wonderful discovery. Ugh, I groaned. Can't we just skip this part and get to the good stuff? He gave me a hurt expression. It is my privilege as an educator of this fine institution to supply the world with knowledge in its entirety. If we just cherry-picked everything we learned, we'd barely know how anything works. Why, I could just imagine us stuck in the medieval ages still trying to cure smallpox with leeches or— Stop. I interrupted. I get it. You can hop off your soapbox now. I'll listen to everything you have on the journal. Rafiq pushed his glasses up past his slightly blushing cheeks. Yes, thank you. As I was about to say, this journal was from a small colonial village, sometime around the mid to late 17th century. The owner was an apothecary named Prudence Abernathy. As I'm sure you know, back in those days the apothecary acted much like a doctor would today. She would have brought in herbs and minerals to sell that kept everyone healthy, or as healthy as they could be in those times. Yeah, and I know their other job was acting as old school wards. How does this help me? I'm getting to that. You see, Prudence was not your average apothecary. She was also fascinated with ghosts. It seemed her father had been her protector spirit since a young age. As she grew older, her fascination turned into an obsession. At times, her entries read like a scientific manual, with detailed notes about experiments involving herbs, magic, and animal sacrifices. Sounds like we've got a witch here, I said. Bet her neighbors would have loved to chase her out of town. Sadly, that is how this story ends. Before that happened, though, she discovered a way to enhance her father's powers. What powers? I said incredulously. Best a ghost can hope to do is knock a cup off a table or— My voice stopped as what I was saying caught up to me. Rafiq smiled. You might see where I'm going with this now. In her journal, she spoke of her father being able to touch the physical world. He was even able to summon a windstorm around them. I pushed my hand through my hair. Shit. She say how she did it? Rafiq carefully flipped another page. Yes, she did. Apparently, she used a conjure bag. Basically, a series of items thrown together and enchanted to create an effect greater than the sum of their parts. I was interested now and leaned over his shoulder to look at the book. Does she say what she used? He pushed me back with one arm. Well, yes and no. She has so many different combinations written in her journal, it could take me months before I got the right one. For now, I'm afraid we've gotten all we can. Rafik turned to me with a forgiving look and was about to speak before I cut him off. I really appreciate what you did for me today, Raf. You've got me light years ahead of where I was before. How about I let you treat me to a drink? His head lifted up at me. Don't you mean the other way around? He said with a grin. Either way. Now hurry up. I think they shut down the milk taps at 9. I don't want to hear you complaining about not getting your vitamin D. Rafik carefully put the journal back in its bag and laid it down on his desk. You know, that is horribly racist, right? Yeah, I said with a shrug. But what's friendship if not a series of horrible jokes you can't let anyone else know you made? A normal relationship? He asked. You've lived too long in the library. From his office, the two of us headed out to Ashley's. It was a local bar that had a wide range of beers from the seasonal to the obscure. Usually it was packed and felt more like a sauna than a bar, but we got lucky that night. We're sharing the place with just a few regulars. We snagged a booth in the back and chatted over a few beers about what we'd been up to in the last few months. It was a good night, and except for the talk of my ex that Rafik weaseled out of me, I didn't have a thing to complain about. At least, until we got to my car. Shit, I said after patting my pockets. I think I left my keys in your office. You didn't just leave them with Clarissa? Usually I do, but I think I grabbed them today. I had other things in my mind. Rafik gave me a smirk. Did a young man catch your eye? I sneered at him as I checked my pockets once more. You already heard what happened between me and Derek. You think I'm about to go hopping after someone else right now? I said with some minor annoyance. Just take me to your office so we can get this over with. All right, Mr. Grumpy, don't overreact. I've got the keys right here. He pulled up a large circle of keys as he spoke. I glimpsed the crowded ring and wondered how he could tell any of them apart. The darkened interior of Angel Hall greeted us as we stepped inside. The only noise we heard were our footsteps as they echoed back at us. As we rode the elevator up to Rafik's floor, he clutched his stomach and wavered on his feet. I think I had too much to drink. I'm not feeling very well. I patted him on the back and carefully led him to a nearby chair. I hear you, man. You relax here for a second while I check your office. I'll take you home right after that, okay? Yes, he responded as he lifted his keys up. Here's the keys to the office. I spotted bits of sweat appearing on his brow. I searched around the small office and saw a trash can sitting nearby. I noted the key I needed and grabbed the ring from his outstretched hand. I pulled the trash can over to Rafik and popped the lid off. If you need to puke, do it in here. I'm not planning on cleaning any floors tonight. I reached his office and pulled the keys out. I tried a few keys I thought were the right one, but cursed myself each time I got it wrong. The low lights made it even more difficult, but eventually I found the right one and unlocked the door. I flipped the light switch on and started looking around my seat and where I was standing earlier. As I searched Rafik's office, I heard him let loose with a loud groan. Just another second, man. They've got to be in here somewhere, I yelled out to him. I felt bad that he was getting sick like he was, but it worked better for me that he was doing it here instead of inside my car. I searched a little longer before I gave up. Ah, shit. Must have left him at the bar. Sorry for making you come back here, man, I yelled out into the hall. I shut the door to his office and made my way over to Rafik. Apparently, he had tipped over the trash can at some point. Bits of garbage lay strewn across the small lobby. Oddly, though, I didn't notice any vomit on the floor. All right, buddy, I said, righting the trash can. Let's get you cleaned up and out of here. His response was much deeper than his voice should have been. Help me. I left the trash can where it was and rushed over to him. Worry started to twist my insides up as I thought about what could be wrong. He was curled up on the floor in the fetal position when I reached him. His body shook all over. I grabbed his arms to try and stop the shaking, but pulled away. His arms felt furry. What the fuck? I said aloud. He turned to face me and I saw his eyes with the same yellow cat eyes he'd always had, but his teeth were sharpened into points, and whiskers had sprouted on his face. My mouth dropped open as his nose widened out and lowered down, while his jaw began to move to accommodate his newly enlarged teeth. I heard bones crack and scrape against each other as his body reshaped itself. I fell backwards on my ass and scooted away from him until I hit a wall, Even then, I tried to push myself through into the other room, where my friend wasn't actively turning into some kind of monster. He looked towards me and I could see tears falling from his glowing eyes. Then he screamed. At first, it was the kind of scream a man might make as his arm was being ripped off, but it shifted into the roar a lion would make before pouncing on its prey. I sat there stunned as I watched my friend transform, and when all was said and done, Rafik as I knew him was gone. What stood there, in his shredded clothes, was a half-man, half-panther monstrosity. Muscles he hadn't had before flexed under fur as his body settled from the transformation. He stood more than a head and a half taller than his usual height now, though his legs held him up shakily. Clearly, he was as prepared for his new body as I was. What was once Rafik raised his large hands to his face and lifted them over. He stretched his fingers out, and several large claws extended to greet him. Rafik jabbed at the trash can, and his claws punched through like it was nothing. He lifted the can over his head and cut several deep gashes into it with his free hand. Punctuating his attack, he ripped the metal can in half with a snarl. The two halves flew through the air and hit the walls. The sound of it all was deafening to my ears as I sat there shaking. Eventually, Rafik's eyes wandered over to me. I didn't know if he could smile with his jaw like it was, but several teeth poked out as his lip raised up. He stalked towards me with an instinctual grace Rafik never had before. I grasped at my pocket shakily, trying to grab my lighter. My mind flashed back to the incident with Gabe, and I almost felt like laughing. Have a homicidal ghost that could throw an entire basement? No problem, I'll handle that with a smile. Watch your friend turn into a monster that could probably eat me? Sorry, I'm not trained for that. Have you called animal control? My hand gripped the beat-up Zippo in my pocket. Rafik was only a few steps away, so I slowly pulled the lighter out. I put my other hand up just as slowly to try and hold him back. It's me, Raph. Bailey. Your friend? He stopped walking and cocked his head to the side as I spoke. I hoped that hesitation meant I was getting through to him. That's it, buddy. You know me. We just had a few drinks together. I don't know what's happened to you, buddy, but we can get through this. Just stay over there, okay? He lowered down to all fours and I saw his tail swish back and forth quickly. His eyes never left mine. I'd seen enough cat videos on the internet to know what came next. I held the lighter out in front of me. Stay back, man, I said with a little more steel in my spine. I doubted he had any idea what I had in my hand, but he'd find out if he didn't keep his distance. You don't want some of this. Trust me. Just stay there, and we can figure something out. His tail swished back and forth a few more times before he leapt at me with both sets of claws extended. I screamed the activation words as I thumbed the flint wheel. Burn! Burn! The wick ignited and the magic came alive. A gout of flame erupted out of the top of the Zippo and bathed the room in light. Rafik's leap took him directly through the flame, and I watched as the singed man-panther tried to cover his face as he crashed through the window that led into the history department's main office. Bits of glass rained down on top of me as the flames from my lighter went out. There was a large streak that stuck in my vision, and several embers dropped from the charred ceiling around me, but I was okay for the moment. I started to stand when my sister floated up from the floor below. She had a bored expression on her face and was clearly ready to go. She looked at me with a puzzled look, then surveyed the damage Rafik and I had caused. When the low growl came from within the office, she spun around and stared at me. She thrust her hands out to the office and then back at me. It's just the theme of my life now, I guess! I shouted at her. She rolled her eyes and pushed me towards the exit sign down at the end of the hall. Wait! What about Rafik? She shook her head while she grabbed my arms and pulled me forcefully toward the door. I tried to resist, but even in death she was able to overpower me. Rafik had made it back into the common area and spotted us moving down the hall. He didn't waste any time and rushed us. Clarissa realized what was about to happen and shoved me down to the ground. My back bent painfully and my knees popped under the sudden pressure, but I was thankful for the pain when I saw Rafik sail through the space my head was a second ago. He landed in a crouch between us and the exit. His muscles were tensed for another leap, but he stayed where he was. Clarissa pointed to the other end of the hall and gave me a solid push. I stumbled at first, but found my footing and started moving away from them towards Rafik's office. The two stared each other down, neither quite sure what the other could do. Clarissa pulled her arms into a fighting stance and advanced. Rafik hissed and took a few cautionary swipes at her as he retreated back a few steps. One of his attacks passed through her stomach and he paused. He held his clawed hand out in confusion, then sent it through her again carefully. Once he realized she wasn't a threat, he rushed right through her towards me. If my sister could have, she'd have let loose with a string of curses. But as it was, all she could do was fly along next to him and try to distract him. I jumped inside Rafiq's office and slammed the door shut, locking both locks immediately. I didn't have long to rest before I heard Rafiq slam against the door. The hallway was too narrow for him to get a running start, but I had a feeling he had more than enough strength to get through. I looked around the room frantically for something I could use as a weapon. I reached his desk and spotted the book he'd shown me earlier. My mind flashed to what he'd said about conjure bags and the power it had given that ghost. It seemed like a long shot, but I didn't have any better ideas. I tore through the room, throwing books out of my way as I went. I heard Rafiq rake his claws against the door. Clarissa phased in and spotted me looking around. "I'm looking for some kind of leather bag! Find it, and we might be able to turn Rafiq back!" She nodded her head once and began scanning the room. She had to wait for me to move stuff around to get a better look, but a second pair of eyes was still better than one. I was near the door when a chunk of it was pulled away, and Rafiq's clawed hand reached inside. Even with the door blocking him, he was still able to cut a pair of horizontal lines across my back. "Ah!" I yelled as I felt blood trickle down into my pants. I watched Rafiq lick his claws and shuddered at how he seemed to enjoy it. The books flew even faster as I redoubled my efforts. My sister grabbed my head and turned it sideways forcefully. My muscles screamed in protest at the unexpected movement. There, buried under several large tomes, I spotted the top of a leather bag. I rushed over and pulled it free. The bag was made of some kind of leather and was covered in runes I'd never seen before. It was oddly warm in my hand and I could hear things inside making noise as they moved around. I didn't know if taking everything out of the bag was enough to stop the spell, but I didn't want to take any chances. I held my lighter below the bag and flicked it with a yell. "Burn!" The wheel spun, but nothing happened. Clarissa and I stared dumbstruck at the lighter. I struck it several more times, but it was more of the same. "You've got to be kidding me!" Another chunk of the door was pulled away. With a better view of us, Rafiq roared in satisfaction and tore at the door even harder. He was making quick work of it now, and we'd only have a moment or two before he made it inside. Clarissa shook my shoulders angrily, trying to figure out what I'd done wrong. "It's not my fault!" I shouted in terror while I kept striking the lighter. "I'm a ward, goddammit, not a fucking wizard!" Just as the last of the door gave way, the wick caught fire. "Burn!" I yelled with everything I had. The flames shot up like earlier, but once they started to burn through the bag, a sickly green color replaced the orange and red. I weaved the flames around my hand so I wouldn't get burnt, but even with that, I could only hold out for a few seconds before the heat became too much. I dropped the remains of the bag as bits of burning leather and whatever was inside spilled out across the ground. The fire continued until everything was either charred black or turned to ash. I looked towards the door and saw Rafiq's form among the remains. He was half inside his office and half in the hallway. I watched as his body slowly shifted back to its usual shape. By the end of it, he was surrounded by black fur and in the remains of his ruined clothes. He groaned once or twice, but stayed on the ground. I doubted he would get up anytime soon, so I left him there. Clarissa sat cross-legged in the air in front of me, her hands on her hips as she gave me a look. "No, I get it. This wasn't a coincidence," I said in response. "Someone's clearly gunning for me. We've got no idea who or why, but at least we have the how." I picked up the remains of the burned leather bag and eyed it. "I'm thinking we just take this to the police and let them deal with it. Why make it our problem?" Clarissa poked my chest and I looked at her. She counted out one finger, then a second, a third, and a fourth. "That's why we get the cops," I said like she was a child. "If whoever this is going to try and kill me again, I'd like to have people whose job it is to protect me doing just that." She shook her head and pointed her finger between me and herself several times. "Yeah, last I checked, you and I are private detectives. I don't even know where to start." She pointed at the bag in my hand. I looked from the bag to her with an incredulous look and thought about what she was implying. I really didn't want to get involved any more than I already was, but it seemed like I was in too deep. The cops might have been able to help, but I felt like the odds were just as good they'd try to blame this on me, like they did with the Robble incident. On top of all that, this person was keeping tabs on me. If they were throwing around magic no one has seen in centuries, could I let myself sit back and wait? I shook my head and gave Clarissa one last look. "You sure there isn't anyone else that could do this?" I asked, already imagining her response. She shook her head the same way I had pictured in my mind a second ago. Fuck it, I said, resigned to my fate. I pocketed the bag and a few of its contents that weren't burned too badly. If I get killed though, you better hope we don't see each other in the afterlife. She nodded her head and we both looked down at my sleeping friend. What do we do with him? She gave me a grin and counted out 911 with her fingers. Fucking brilliant, I sighed.
Tales to the Void is a collection of stories written and performed by Jacob and Flitty. Music and production by Robert Labadie. Additional mixing this week by Dan Zazadny. Thanks for listening. Hope you enjoyed. Until next time.